Matt Hughes was once the most dominant force in the UFC. A two-time welterweight champion, he ragdolled legends like Georges St-Pierre and BJ Penn before fans even understood what wrestling control really looked like. In the early 2000s, if you heard his walkout music, you knew someone was about to get mauled. But in 2017, his life changed forever. Not in the cage, but on a train track. The collision nearly ended everything. Brain trauma, memory loss, months in a coma. What followed wasn't a dramatic comeback, it was a brutal fight for basic survival. And today, while the cameras are off, Matt Hughes is still in the fight of his life. This is the heartbreaking story of how a fighter who once controlled everything lost control of everything. Before Matt Hughes was a two-time UFC champion, before the walkouts and title defenses, he was just a tough farm boy from Hillsboro, Illinois. Born on October 13, 1973, into a blue-collar family with twin brother Mark by his side, Matt grew up surrounded by cornfields and chores. There were no spotlight dreams, no talk of fame, just hard labor, small-town grit, and an unshakable will to outwork everyone around him. He didn't learn discipline in a gym. He learned it waking up before dawn to bale hay, chop wood, and fix fences. Wrestling became his escape, but not from pain, from repetition, from limits. He started in high school, quickly making a name as a relentless competitor. He wasn't the flashiest athlete, but he had something else: grit, control, and an iron will to break the other guy's soul. At Eastern Illinois University, Hughes became a two-time NCAA Division Bowerman All-American, compiling over 80 wins. But while his peers dreamed of Olympic wrestling careers, Matt's path veered. He stumbled onto something newer, rawer, and far more dangerous: mixed martial arts. In the late 90s, MMA was still viewed as barbaric, human cockfighting. UFC fighters bled for a few $100s in dusty arenas. But to Hughes, it was just another farm job, another opponent to break. He didn't care about money. He wanted control, and in the cage, he found it. Hughes debuted in 1998, winning with overwhelming force. No polish, no finesse, just pure wrestling domination. Slam, smother, finish. It didn't take long for promoters to notice the quiet country boy who treated opponents like livestock. UFC scouts were watching, and soon, Matt Hughes stepped into the Octagon not just as a competitor, but as a storm in denim jeans and wrestling boots. But even then, no one could have predicted what he'd become: a decade-defining champion. The welterweight wall, a man whose strength came not just from technique but from pain, buried deep under the soil he came from. And once he entered the cage, nothing would ever be the same again. When Matt Hughes entered the UFC officially, the sport was just beginning to find its footing. Legends like Royce Gracie had laid the groundwork, but it was Hughes who brought brutal efficiency to a new level. No fighter in the early 2000s embodied control the way he did. Hughes didn't just win, he erased hope. Opponents were dragged to the mat and held down like prey beneath a mountain lion. And the crowd, brutal as ever, loved it. His breakthrough came at UFC 34, when he faced welterweight champion Carlos Newton. Newton was the flashier fighter. Once he had you down, he could hold you there for the full fight, drowning you in frustration. But it wasn't just his physical strength, it was the mentality. Hughes trained like a soldier. He hunted like a machine, and he believed in punishment. Not just to win, but to humble. In interviews, he openly admitted to breaking people mentally, to enjoying watching their will disappear across 3 rounds. It wasn't sadism, it was a strategy. You don't submit a fighter's body, you submit their belief that they can win. And UFC management loved him. Hughes was American, clean-cut, and dominant. He fit the brand. Sponsors came in. Fans wore Team Hughes shirts. He was named Fighter of the Year by multiple outlets. For a while, Matt Hughes was the UFC's poster boy, the standard all others were measured against. But MMA evolves fast. And by 2006, the sport was changing. Flashier fighters, newer stars, and a younger name rising fast through the ranks. A fighter from Canada named Georges St-Pierre. And with him came the beginning beginning of the end. In combat sports, you don't just build a legacy through wins, you build it through wars. And Matt Hughes had wars. The names he faced read like a UFC Hall of Fame roster. But it wasn't just about opponents. It was about rivalries, fights where pride, legacy, and emotion all collided. And none hit harder than his trilogies with BJ Penn and Georges St-Pierre. The feud with BJ Penn was fire and gasoline. In 2004, Hughes was on top of the world. He had 5 consecutive title defenses. No one seemed close. Then Penn moved up a weight class and shocked the MMA world by submitting Hughes in the first round. It was a massive upset, and it bruised Matt's aura of invincibility. Penn was cocky, creative, and wild. Everything Hughes wasn't. But Matt didn't fold. He came back, and in 2006, they rematched. This time, Hughes outlasted the early flurry, wore Penn down, and finished him in round 3. It wasn't just redemption, it was a statement. The rubber match came years later, but by then, both were past their peak. Still, the war left scars, but his rivalry with Georges St-Pierre defined a new era. In 2004, a young GSP stepped into the cage with Matt Hughes. The outcome seemed inevitable, and it was. Hughes submitted him in round 1, but GSP wasn't just another victim. He studied, adapted, and in their 2006 rematch, he returned like a different man. Hughes couldn't take him down, couldn't control him. GSP destroyed him with strikes and finished him with a head kick and ground and pound. It was a torch-passing moment, and it shook Matt deeply. They fought a third time in 2007. This time, Hughes lost again. The takedowns didn't work. The strength didn't matter. The game had evolved, and Matt, for all his dominance, had been surpassed by someone younger, faster, and more technical. It wasn't just a loss, it was the beginning of the end. The sport was moving on. Hughes could still fight, but the cage wasn't his anymore. And though he retired in 2011, it never felt like closure. Because for men like Matt Hughes, the hardest part of war is learning when to stop fighting. By 2008, the writing was on the wall. Matt Hughes, once the unstoppable force of the UFC welterweight division, was no longer ahead of the curve. The sport had evolved, and so had the athletes. Fighters like Georges St-Pierre, Thiago Alves, and Josh Koscheck represented a new breed. They were faster, more dynamic, and trained in ways that hadn't existed during Hughes's prime. But what hurt Hughes the most wasn't the new blood. It was the slow realization that the cage no longer feared him. His last few years in the UFC were a mix of brief comebacks and painful reminders. He beat Matt Serra in 2009 in a grudge match that settled one of his final rivalries, but he was knocked out by BJ Penn in 21 seconds in 2010, and then again by Josh Koscheck in 2011. His wrestling, once feared, now looked one-dimensional. The power was fading. The reaction time, once perfect, was lagging behind, and the cage, where he used to write history, had turned into a mirror reflecting age, damage, and fragility. Hughes finally retired in 2013. The official statement was brief, respectful, and focused on his legacy. But privately, it wasn't an easy decision. Fighting wasn't a hobby for Matt. It was who he was. From the age of 5, he had wrestled. For decades, combat was his routine, his therapy, his identity, and now it was gone. Dana White offered him a role as the UFC's Vice President of Athlete Development and Government Relations. It was a soft landing, a desk job meant to keep Hughes close to the sport. He accepted. For a while, it seemed like a good fit. Hughes attended events, gave interviews, and stayed visible. But if you looked closely, you could see it wasn't the same. He didn't light up around fighters. He didn't feel like part of the ecosystem anymore. He looked like a war hero sitting behind glass at a museum dedicated to a war that had moved on. He tried to stay relevant, hosted hunting shows, did seminars, but none of it scratched the itch. Matt Hughes had never been good at sitting still, and now, for the first time in his life, that was all he could do. And beneath the surface, something was brewing, a restlessness, a storm that would soon boil over in a way no one expected. Because Matt Hughes's most dangerous fight wasn't behind him. It was waiting for him far from the cage, on a quiet railroad crossing in the summer of 2017. On June 16, 2017, everything changed. It was a normal day in Raymond, Illinois. Matt Hughes was driving his pickup truck through a rural stretch of road, heading toward his family's farm. The area was quiet, open, open and familiar, exactly the kind of setting he felt most comfortable in. As he approached a railroad crossing with no active warning lights, the timing couldn't have been worse. An oncoming train roared down the tracks at full speed. The collision was immediate and violent. Hughes's truck was struck on the passenger side and hurled into a ditch. First responders arrived to find him unresponsive, trapped in the mangled vehicle. They had to airlift him to a trauma center in Springfield, where he was placed into a medically induced coma. His family prepared for the worst. Doctors warned that even if he survived, he might never walk again. He might never speak again. His brain had suffered catastrophic injury from the impact. Fans across the MMA world were stunned. Matt Hughes, the Matt Hughes, was in a coma, clinging to life not from a fight, but from a fluke accident that didn't care about his toughness, his championships, or his legacy. The UFC issued a statement. Fighters sent prayers, but for a long time, there was only silence. Updates were minimal. His family requested privacy, and everyone feared the worst. For weeks, there was no movement, no word, just a man, unconscious in a hospital bed, his face battered, his body motionless. And then something happened. He woke up. But it wasn't like in the movies. There was no tearful reunion, no instant recognition. Matt's eyes opened, but his mind was scrambled. He couldn't talk. He didn't know what year it was. He had to relearn everything: speech, motor skills, even how to hold a fork. His muscles had atrophied. His balance was gone. His memory was fragmented. The man who once dominated the UFC physically now faced the unimaginable, having to rebuild from scratch. And that was just the physical side. The emotional toll, the realization that he might never again be the man he was, had only just begun to sink in. When Matt Hughes finally emerged from his coma, he wasn't greeted by cameras or media. He was surrounded by therapists, machines, and a reality he didn't recognize. He had survived the train, but survival came at a price. His body, once an unshakable fortress, now needed assistance to stand. His brain, once laser-focused in combat, struggled to retain short-term memory. His personality, once calm and stoic, now shifted rapidly. Emotional, withdrawn, unpredictable. The world had moved on, but Matt had to start over. Physical therapy became his new training camp. Each day was a battle, relearning balance, grip strength, even eye contact. Simple tasks were exhausting. There were moments of progress. A video of him walking down a hallway went viral. Another showed him tossing a medicine ball. Fans cheered him on, calling him still a warrior. But what those clips didn't show was the suffering between the smiles, the dizziness, the confusion, the pain that didn't come from punches, but from the body rejecting its old rhythm. Matt's twin brother Mark became his caretaker. Their bond, forged in childhood, was tested in adulthood. Mark described moments where Matt didn't remember conversations they just had, times where anger flared without warning, nights where he'd sit in silence, staring off, like a man grieving the loss of someone only he could see, his former self. His wife, Audra, struggled too. The man she knew, confident, stable, strong, was now fragmented. She later revealed in court documents that Matt's behavior changed significantly after the accident. He became controlling, angry, even dangerous. Brain trauma, especially to the frontal lobe, can cause personality shifts. But that didn't make it easier. Behind the public recovery, a private storm was building. Hughes was alive, but he wasn't whole. He had spent his life mastering control. Control over opponents, over fights, over fear. But now, he couldn't control his own hands, his own thoughts, his own emotions. For a man who had built his identity around dominance, waking up in a world where he had none was more than a challenge. It was a form of living grief. And deep down, Matt Hughes knew the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Matt Hughes had faced legends. He'd out-wrestled titans, taken punches from the hardest hitters in the game, and walked out of wars with his hands raised. But nothing prepared him for this. The opponent wasn't a man. It was the void, the loss of identity, the suffocating realization that everything he once was, champion, athlete, hunter, father, had slipped away during those seconds of impact on the train tracks. After the accident, Matt's body began to heal. His speech returned in broken phrases. His walk, though shaky, became possible with assistance. But his mind, that was a different story. People close to him described flickers of the old Matt. A confident nod, a sharp comeback, a smile at the mention of old teammates. But those moments were just that, flickered. Most of the time, he drifted in and out of clarity. He tried to stay positive. He posted short videos, smiled in recovery clips, told fans he was blessed to be alive. But behind the camera, there was nothing but time and silence. No coaches, no fight camps, no crowd chanting his name. Just the echo of who he used to be. He couldn't train anymore, couldn't drive alone. His days revolved around rehab and naps. For a man who once lived minute to minute with precision, the aimlessness of recovery was excruciating. He missed the structure, missed the grind, and with no fight on the calendar, no comeback to chase, he began to deteriorate emotionally. Depression set in. Brain injury survivors often speak of the cloud that hangs over them. Hughes described it as a fog. He'd forget what he was doing mid-sentence, forget who he was talking to, and when he realized, the frustration boiled over into rage. The control he once held in the cage, tight, surgical, absolute, was gone, and that loss created a void. He became more volatile, more paranoid. Friends pulled back, family members began to worry. Even his tone shifted. He'd swing from soft-spoken confusion to explosive frustration, like a fighter shadowboxing an enemy no one else could see. And the cruelest irony? Matt Hughes was still strong enough to look like a fighter, but not stable enough to be one. He had the shell, but not the core. He was still alive, still walking, still recognizable, but the part of him that mattered most, the fight, had vanished. By 2019, the cracks in Matt Hughes's personal life weren't just visible, they were gaping. What had started as subtle mood swings and memory lapses had now transformed into full-blown volatility. His family, once a source of strength, now found themselves walking on eggshells, and eventually, something snapped. That year, Hughes's wife, Audra, filed a restraining order. The details, revealed through court documents, were harrowing. She alleged that Matt had become physically threatening, emotionally abusive, and frighteningly unpredictable. The report detailed instances of Matt choking her, hitting her in front of their daughter, and even physically attacking her father during a family disagreement. It was a devastating blow, not just to Matt's image, but to the legacy he had built. The champion, the role model, the small-town hero, now stood accused of terrifying the very people he once protected. Audra's account described a man she didn't recognize, someone who couldn't handle frustration, who erupted over minor confusion, who used his size and strength not in defense, but in control. Friends close to the family confirmed that Matt's personality had shifted since the accident. He wasn't evil, they said, but he wasn't well. And the brain trauma offered an explanation, but not an excuse. Audra wasn't the only one affected. Matt's twin brother, Mark, had been his closest ally. But even he admitted in interviews that post-accident, Matt was a different person. His brain injury changed everything, Mark said. There are days when I don't know who I'm talking to. The court granted a temporary restraining order. The media, always quick to celebrate a comeback story, now turned the lens on something much darker. The man they had once called unstoppable was now a danger to his own home. It was a haunting reversal. Once admired for his calm demeanor under pressure, Matt was now living with impulse control issues, confusion, and aggression, all textbook symptoms of traumatic brain injury. But for his family, it didn't matter what caused it. They just wanted safety. There were no dramatic interviews from Matt, no public apology, just silence. His Instagram went quiet. His public appearances slowed. It seemed the world that had once applauded him now didn't know what to do with him. And perhaps that was the cruelest part. There was no villain, no easy narrative, just a man destroyed by tragedy, and a family trying to survive the fallout. Today, Matt Hughes lives in near-total obscurity. The UFC occasionally honors him with a nostalgic clip or a ceremonial mention, but his name no longer rings with the same power. He is a Hall of Famer, yes, a two-time two-time welterweight champion, a pioneer. But behind the accolades lies a man many no longer recognize. He occasionally posts to social media, usually rehab updates or glimpses of rural life. But the comments have changed. Where there was once awe, there is now discomfort. Conflicted fans unsure how to separate the warrior from the wreckage. Hughes has become a symbol, not just of strength, but of what happens when strength disappears. Those close to him say he has good days and bad. Some days, he walks with pride and smiles like nothing ever happened. Others, he forgets names, becomes overwhelmed by noise, or lashes out in confusion. The long-term effects of the accident have settled into permanence. This isn't a temporary setback. It's a lifelong battle. He remains proud, still fiercely private. But even in the best of moments, there's a sense of loss that hangs in the air. The Matt Hughes who once carried fighters into the sky and slammed them into the canvas, the one who walked out to "A Country Boy Can Survive," is gone. The body is still there. The voice still sounds familiar, but the man who lived inside that frame, the one who dominated an era, he's only visible in flashes. And the most painful part of all? He knows it. In one rare interview, he was asked what he misses most. He paused, then simply said, "Being me." That's the heartbreak of Matt Hughes. He survived every war the UFC threw at him. He beat legends, defined an era. But the one fight he never saw coming, the train, the brain injury, the unraveling, was the one that took the most. Now, Matt Hughes walks through life not as a fighter, but as a reminder that even the strongest can break. That sometimes the cage wasn't the real danger, and that survival isn't the same as healing.